Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin.
Story 1. The room that stayed assigned. I was holding the printout when I realized my hand had started shaking. Not the tremor of fear, not yet, but the involuntary response of a system administrator who has just discovered that the system itself has become unreliable. Room 214 had been flagged for discharge processing 6 days earlier. The resident, Evelyn Moss, had passed quietly on a Tuesday morning. I had processed the paperwork myself. I had updated the census. I had marked the bed as available and assigned housekeeping to prepare it for the next admission. But according to the electronic health record system, room 214 remained occupied, and not just occupied, actively receiving care. The Meadowbrook Care Facility had operated for 31 years without a single major administrative error. We prided ourselves on precision. I had worked there for 7 years as the admissions coordinator, and my job hinged on one fundamental principle. Beds were a resource, and resources had to be tracked with absolute accuracy. We maintained a 96-bed facility across 3 wings: acute care, memory care, and long-term residential. Every morning at 7, I ran the occupancy report. Every evening at 5, I reconciled discharges and pending admissions. The system was designed to prevent exactly what I was looking at now: a phantom occupancy. I first noticed the discrepancy on Thursday morning. I had arrived at 6:45 as always and began my routine audit. The report showed 94 occupied beds. I knew we should have had 93. I cross-referenced the discharge log. Evelyn Moss, room 214, discharge date noted as 6 days prior. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Next of kin notified. Belongings collected. Final billing completed. Everything had been processed correctly, yet the bed status field still read occupied. I assumed it was a clerical error. Someone had forgotten to toggle the status after processing the discharge. It happened occasionally with newer staff, though rarely. I opened the room assignment module and attempted to manually override the status to available. The system rejected the change. A dialog box appeared. Cannot modify. Active care plan in progress. That gave me pause. I checked the care plan tab. It was still populated. Medication schedule, dietary restrictions, mobility assistance, all still listed as if Evelyn Moss were still receiving care. I deleted the care plan entirely and tried again. The system rejected it a second time. This time the message read, "Resident requires continued observation." I walked down to the IT office on the first floor. Gary Mitchell had been our systems administrator for almost as long as I had been there. He was methodical, patient, and rarely surprised by software glitches. I explained the issue. He logged into the back end of the database and pulled up room 214. He frowned at the screen for a long moment, then ran a query to check for corrupted entries. Nothing came back flagged. He manually cleared the care plan, reset the occupancy status, and pushed the update. We both watched as the system refreshed. The status toggled to available for exactly 4 seconds. Then it reverted. Occupied. Active care plan reinstated. Gary tried 3 more times with increasing levels of administrative access. Each time the change held briefly, then reverted. He suggested we might be looking at a database sync issue, something pulling outdated information from a backup server. He scheduled a full system diagnostic for that evening and told me to try again in the morning. I thanked him and returned to my office, though the unease that had started as mild irritation had begun to curdle into something heavier. That afternoon, I received a call from the pharmacy. They were confirming a medication delivery for room 214. I told them the room was vacant. The pharmacist, a woman named Linda Calloway, sounded confused. She said the order had come through the system that morning. Standard refill for a resident named Evelyn Moss. I told her Evelyn Moss had passed away nearly a week ago. There was a pause. Linda said she would cancel the order and flag the account. I hung up and immediately pulled the medication log. There it was, a refill request generated at 9:32 that morning. The prescribing physician was listed as Dr. Raymond Holt, who had indeed been Evelyn's primary care provider. I called his office. His nurse confirmed that no such order had been placed. She checked his digital signature log. Nothing recent for Evelyn Moss, yet the system had generated the request anyway. I sent an email to Gary marked urgent. He replied within minutes saying he was already seeing similar anomalies in the activity logs. Room 214 was generating routine care documentation. Vital sign checks, repositioning notes, hydration records, all time-stamped and populated as if nursing staff were continuing their rounds. But no one had entered that room since housekeeping had cleaned it on Wednesday. I asked him if this was some kind of automated template error. He said he didn't think so. Templates didn't write unique observation notes. I opened the nursing documentation module and pulled up the entries for room 214. The most recent note had been logged at 2:15 that afternoon. It read, "Resident resting comfortably. No acute distress, vitals stable, repositioned to left side per care plan." The note was attributed to Jenny Callahan, one of our day shift LPNs. I walked down to the nurse's station and found Jenny finishing her charting. I asked her if she had been in room 214 today. She looked at me like I had asked her to solve a calculus problem. She said the room had been empty all week. I showed her the note on my tablet. Her face went pale. She said she hadn't written that. She hadn't even opened that chart. I believed her. Jenny had been with us for 4 years and had never falsified a record. I returned to my office and called Gary again. This time I didn't wait for him to answer. I told him we needed to take the system offline and perform a full audit. He agreed. We scheduled downtime for that night after the evening shift change. I spent the rest of the afternoon manually verifying every other room assignment, looking for similar anomalies. There were none, only room 214. At 6:30 that evening, I was still at my desk when I heard the call light chime from the second floor. It was a soft, repetitive tone, familiar and unremarkable in a facility like ours. But something about it pulled my attention. I checked the call light panel on my computer. Room 214. I stared at the screen. The light was active. I stood and walked upstairs. The hallway was quiet. Most residents were in the dining hall or their rooms. I reached room 214 and looked inside. The bed was made. The room was empty. The call light above the door was dark, but on my screen it still showed as active. I pressed the button on the wall panel to reset it. The chime stopped. I returned to my office. The call light was no longer flagged. But 10 minutes later it activated again. Gary arrived at 8. We shut down the electronic health record system and ran the diagnostic. It took nearly 3 hours. When the results came back, Gary sat in silence for a long time before he spoke. He said the database showed no corruption, no sync errors, no external access. Every entry for room 214 had been generated internally using valid credentials at valid timestamps. The system believed it was documenting real care for a real resident. He asked me if there was any possibility that someone had been entering the room and manually logging false information as a prank. I told him I had checked the keycard logs. No one had accessed room 214 since the discharge except housekeeping and myself. He nodded slowly. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said the care notes were progressively detailed, not repetitive, not copied. Each one described a different observation, different positioning, different times of day, as if someone were actually monitoring a living person. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the phrase that had appeared in every single note. Resident resting comfortably. It was standard language. We all used it, but the repetition felt deliberate now, as if the system were trying to reassure me. The next morning, I arrived early and ran the report again. Room 214 occupied. I opened the chart. A new note had been logged at 3:47 in the morning. Night shift. The nurse listed was Marcus Trent. The note read, resident resting comfortably, no acute distress, vitals stable, routine observation completed. I called Marcus before he left his shift. He confirmed he had not been in that room. He hadn't even been on that wing. He worked memory care on the 3rd floor. I showed him the note. He looked at me and said very quietly that he wanted his name removed from that chart. I told him I would try. I spent the rest of that day trying to override the system, trying to purge the records, trying to find any explanation that fit within the boundaries of logic and software functionality. Nothing worked. By the end of the day, I had documented 16 separate care entries for a deceased resident, all generated without human input, all clinically plausible, all ending with the same reassurance. On Monday, I contacted the software vendor. I explained the issue in technical terms, carefully avoiding any implication of the supernatural. They remote accessed our system and reviewed the logs. After 2 hours, the lead technician told me the system was functioning normally. I asked how that was possible. He said the entries were valid, the timestamps were sequential, the documentation was consistent with standard care protocols. I asked him who was writing them. He said the system didn't generate content autonomously. Someone with valid credentials had to input the data. I told him no one had. He said that according to the access logs, someone had. Then he disconnected. That evening, I stood outside room 214 and considered what it would mean to simply accept the impossibility, to let the room remain occupied in the system, to stop fighting the entries, to let the care continue even though no one was receiving it. I thought about Evelyn Moss, who had been a resident for 3 years before her death. She had been a retired librarian, quiet, methodical. She had liked her routines. She had requested the same seat in the dining hall every day. She had kept a notebook by her bed where she wrote down the names of staff members so she wouldn't forget them. I returned to my office and opened her file one last time. I read through the care notes that had been written while she was alive, comparing them to the ones being generated now. The tone was identical. The phrasing was identical. It was as if the system had learned how to care for her and couldn't stop, even after she was gone. I don't try to change the status anymore. Room 214 remains occupied. The care notes continue to populate. Every evening the call light activates once, briefly, and then resets. I've stopped responding, but I check the log each morning, and each morning the same phrase appears at the end of the most recent entry. Resident resting comfortably. I've started to wonder if comfort is something that can outlast the person who needed it. If the routines we build around care can become so ingrained that they continue on their own, independent of the people they were meant to serve. Or maybe the system knows something I don't. Maybe it's still documenting something real. Some records never stop updating, even after everyone who signed them is gone. Story 2. Night Rounds, Unit C. The resident in room 308 answered my question before I opened the door. I had been standing in the hallway reviewing the vitals chart on my mobile unit, preparing to ask if she needed repositioning. I looked up. The door was still closed. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the bedside monitor. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Margaret Pryor was lying on her back, hands folded on her chest, eyes open and focused on the ceiling. I asked her if she had called out. She turned her head toward me and smiled faintly. She said she hadn't. I asked if she needed anything. She said no. I documented the interaction, completed the vitals check, and moved on. But the unease stayed with me for the rest of the shift. I had been a licensed practical nurse at Hartfield Manor for 9 years. I had worked night shift exclusively for the last 6. Night rounds were the backbone of my routine. I covered Unit C, which housed 42 residents, most of them in advanced stages of dementia or requiring palliative care. The schedule was rigid. Rounds began at 10 p.m., repeated at midnight, 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. Each round followed the same sequence: check vitals, assess comfort, reposition if needed, document observations, move to the next room. It was methodical, predictable, and comforting in its monotony. I liked the quiet. I liked the rhythm. I liked knowing exactly where I was supposed to be at any given moment. Margaret Pryor had been admitted to Unit C 11 months earlier. She was 83, a former high school mathematics teacher, sharp-minded but physically frail. She had suffered a stroke that left her with limited mobility on her right side. She was pleasant, conversational, and preferred to sleep with the lights off. She never used the call button. She never complained. She was, by all measures, an ideal resident. But over the past 3 weeks, she had started answering my questions before I asked them. The first time it happened, I assumed I had spoken aloud without realizing it. I had been standing outside her room about to ask if she wanted her pillow adjusted. Then I heard her say from inside the room, "Yes, thank you." I entered and adjusted the pillow as requested. I didn't think much of it. The second time, I was in the hallway reviewing my medication cart, mentally preparing to ask if she had any pain. She said, "Just a little in my hip." Again, I entered, assessed her, and documented it. I quickened my pace and entered her room. She was already turned slightly toward her left side, as if anticipating my assistance. I began to pay closer attention. I started noting the exact moment I formed the intention to ask a question and the moment she responded. The gap was never more than a few seconds. It was as if she could hear my thoughts before they became words. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe I had a predictable routine. Maybe she had memorized the timing of my rounds and was simply anticipating what I would ask based on the pattern. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't account for the specificity of her answers. Or the fact that she responded even when I had decided to skip a question entirely. One night, I deliberately altered my routine. I started my rounds at 10:15 instead of 10. I changed the order of the rooms. I approached room 308 from the opposite direction. I stood outside her door and decided consciously not to ask her anything. I would simply enter, check her vitals, and leave without speaking. Before I reached for the door handle, I heard her voice, quiet but distinct. "You don't have to say anything." I froze. My hand was still 6 inches from the door. I stood there for a full minute, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. Then I entered. Margaret was awake, looking at me with the same faint smile. I asked her how she had known I was there. She said she always knew when I was near. She said she could feel the rhythm of my steps, the way the air in the hallway shifted when I approached. I nodded and documented the vitals check, but I didn't believe her explanation. The hallway floors were carpeted. My steps were silent, and the air didn't shift. I started reviewing the security logs. Hartfield Manor had a keycard access system that logged every entry and exit. Each staff member's ID badge recorded the time and location of every door they passed through. I pulled my logs for the past 2 weeks. The data should have shown a consistent pattern, entry into each room in sequence, timestamps spaced approximately 6 to 8 minutes apart. Instead, the logs showed something different. According to the system, I had been entering rooms out of order, not drastically, just enough to be noticeable. Room 308 appeared in my log before room 306, even though I knew I had followed the correct sequence. The timestamps were also irregular. Some entries showed me in 2 rooms simultaneously. Others showed gaps where no entry was recorded, even though I distinctly remembered being there. I brought the discrepancy to the attention of our night shift supervisor, a woman named Denise Harmon. She reviewed the logs with me and agreed that the data didn't match my reported routine. She suggested the card reader system might be malfunctioning. She filed a maintenance request. 2 days later, the system was inspected and cleared. No hardware issues, no software errors. The logs were accurate, according to the technician. I asked him how that was possible. He said the system didn't lie. If the timestamps were irregular, then my movements must have been irregular. I told him they weren't. He shrugged and moved on to his next task. I began to second-guess myself. Maybe I had been distracted. Maybe I had unconsciously altered my routine without realizing it. Maybe the stress of 9 years on night shift was finally catching up to me. I started keeping a handwritten log, documenting every room I entered, every question I asked, every response I received. I recorded the time on my watch at each interaction. I was determined to prove the system wrong. On the 4th night of my self-imposed audit, Margaret answered a question I had written down, but not yet spoken aloud. I looked down at my notepad. The question was still written there, unspoken. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I entered the room and offered her water. She drank slowly, thanked me, and settled back into her pillow. I asked her as calmly as I could how she had known I was going to ask that. She looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read. Part amusement, part pity, she said, "You always ask, honey." But I wasn't, not anymore. I had been deliberately randomizing my questions, changing the order, altering the phrasing. She shouldn't have been able to predict anything, unless she wasn't predicting, unless she was hearing something I wasn't aware I was broadcasting. I started testing her. I would stand outside her door and think a question without writing it down, without forming the words in my mouth. I would focus on the question, visualize asking it, and wait. More often than not, she would respond, not always with the exact words I had thought, but with an answer that corresponded to the question I had intended to ask. It was as if the intention itself was enough, as if the act of preparing to speak created a signal she could detect. I told Denise about it. She listened patiently, then suggested I might be experiencing fatigue. She recommended I take a few nights off. I declined. I wasn't tired, I was terrified, but I couldn't explain why without sounding irrational. So I kept working, kept documenting, kept testing, and Margaret kept answering. One night, I decided to skip her room entirely. I would break the routine completely. I would document her as sleeping comfortably without actually entering. It was a violation of protocol, but I needed to know if she would react. I completed my rounds up to room 306, then moved directly to room 310. I logged Margaret's room as checked without going inside. The next morning, I reviewed the security logs. According to the system, I had entered room 308. The timestamp matched the time I would have entered if I had followed my usual routine. But I hadn't. I had deliberately skipped it. I requested the security footage. The video showed me entering the room, conducting a vitals check, and leaving. I watched the footage 3 times. It was me, my uniform, my ID badge, my movements. But I had no memory of it. I began to suspect I was experiencing some kind of dissociative episode, that the stress and monotony of night shift had fractured my perception of time, that I was performing my duties on autopilot and simply not retaining the memory. I scheduled an appointment with a physician. I described the memory gaps, the inconsistent logs, the sense that my routine was unfolding independently of my conscious participation. She ordered a sleep study and recommended a psychiatric evaluation. Both came back unremarkable. I was healthy, I was sane, I was simply inexplicably losing track of my own actions. But Margaret never lost track. Every night she answered my questions before I asked them. Every night the log showed me entering her room even when I didn't remember doing so. And every night the timestamps corrected themselves once I noticed the discrepancy, as if the system were adjusting to accommodate my awareness. I stopped trying to change my routine. I followed the same sequence every night, asked the same questions in the same order, documented the same observations. And Margaret continued to respond before I spoke. I stopped testing her. I stopped questioning the logs. I accepted that something in Unit C had learned the rhythm of my rounds better than I had, and that whatever it was, it had started moving me through the motions even when I tried to resist. Margaret passed away 3 weeks ago. Congestive heart failure. Quiet. Peaceful. Expected. I was there when it happened. I had just finished her midnight vitals check. She had smiled at me and said, "You're always so careful." Then she closed her eyes and stopped breathing. I called the attending physician. I documented the time of death. I followed protocol, but the security logs still show me entering room 308 every night. The timestamps are precise, the sequence is perfect. And sometimes when I stand outside her door, I hear a voice, faint and familiar, answering questions I haven't yet decided to ask. I've started to wonder if routines are stronger than the people who perform them. If the repetition of care can imprint itself so deeply that it continues even after the care is no longer needed. Or maybe I've been following a script written by someone else for so long that I've forgotten how to deviate from it. Some shifts end, but the rounds never do. Story 3. The medication cart discrepancy. The count was off by 3 tablets. I stood in the medication room staring at the inventory log, trying to reconcile what the system was telling me with what I had physically verified. Controlled substances were counted at the beginning and end of every shift. The process was rigid. 2 nurses, both present, both signing off on the tallied amounts. We had done this for 11 years without a single unresolved discrepancy. But now, the system showed that 3 tablets of lorazepam had been administered to a resident whose chart had been closed for 6 days. The resident was Harold Brennan, room 112, deceased on a Monday afternoon from complications of pneumonia. I had signed his final medication log myself. I had returned his remaining prescriptions to the pharmacy. I had closed his account in the electronic health record system. Yet according to the controlled substance report, 3 doses had been dispensed from his allotment since his death. I am the senior charge nurse at Riverside Meadows Extended Care. I oversee medication administration, staff training, and regulatory compliance for a 108-bed facility. Precision is not optional in my role. A single missing tablet can trigger an investigation, a loss of accreditation, and criminal liability. So when I saw the discrepancy, my first response was not fear but procedural. I assumed human error. Someone had miscounted, someone had mislabeled, someone had failed to document correctly. I pulled the shift logs and identified the nurses who had conducted the counts over the past 6 days. I interviewed each of them individually. None of them recalled any irregularities, none of them had noticed the discrepancy, and all of them confirmed that they had followed protocol. I ran a full audit of the medication cart. Every controlled substance was present and accounted for, except the 3 lorazepam tablets attributed to Harold Brennan. I checked the destruction log to see if the medication had been disposed of and improperly recorded. It hadn't. I checked the transfer log to see if it had been moved to another resident's allotment. It hadn't. I checked the spillage and waste log. Nothing. The medication had simply been marked as administered. 3 separate entries, 3 separate timestamps, 3 separate shifts. All logged under Harold Brennan's resident ID. All marked as delivered without incident. I contacted the pharmacy to see if they had any record of the discrepancy. The pharmacist, a man named Alan Greer, pulled the dispensing logs for Harold's account. He confirmed that the original prescription had been returned in full after the resident's death. No additional tablets had been issued. He checked the automated dispensing system and found the same entries I had. 3 doses administered post-mortem. He said it was impossible. The system required a valid resident ID, a valid prescription, and a valid nurse signature. All 3 elements had to align for a dose to be logged. He asked me if someone had falsified the records. I told him I didn't know, but I intended to find out. I pulled the electronic signatures associated with the 3 doses. The first was attributed to Linda Marsh, a day shift RN who had been with us for 6 years. The second was attributed to Eric Hollis, an evening shift LPN. The third was attributed to me. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to process what that meant. I had not administered medication to Harold Brennan after his death. I had not accessed his chart. I had not even thought about his case since completing the discharge paperwork. Yet there was my name, my credentials, my electronic signature, time-stamped at 4:37 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I checked my schedule. I had been off duty that day. I had been home, asleep, nowhere near the facility. I called Linda and Eric separately. Both of them denied administering the doses. Linda said she had worked Unit B that day and had no reason to access Harold's chart. Eric said he hadn't even been on shift the day his signature appeared. I pulled the staffing logs to confirm. Eric was right. He had called in sick. His badge hadn't registered at the facility. Yet the system showed his signature on a medication administration record at 9:15 p.m. I escalated the issue to our director of nursing, a woman named Patricia Crowley. She reviewed the data with the same procedural calm I had tried to maintain. She agreed that the discrepancy was serious. She initiated a formal investigation. She contacted the software vendor to determine if the system had been compromised. The vendor ran a security audit. No unauthorized access, no data corruption, no external breaches. The entries were legitimate, according to the system. They had been generated internally using valid credentials at valid timestamps. The vendor suggested that the signatures might have been electronically duplicated due to a software bug, but they couldn't explain why the entries were all associated with a deceased resident. Patricia asked me to review the physical location of the medication cart during the times the doses were allegedly administered. I pulled the security footage. The facility had cameras in every hallway, every common area, and every medication room. I started with the first entry, Linda Marsh's signature at 2:20 p.m. on the Tuesday after Harold's death. The footage showed the medication cart in the hallway outside room 112. Linda was not present. No one was. The cart was stationary, locked, unattended. I watched for 15 minutes. The cart did not move. No one approached it. Yet the system logged a dose administration at 2:20 p.m. I reviewed the second entry, Eric Hollis's signature at 9:15 p.m. on Wednesday. The cart was in the same location. The hallway was empty. The camera showed no activity. I fast-forwarded through the footage, looking for any sign of tampering, any indication that someone had accessed the cart off camera. There was nothing. The third entry, the one with my signature, showed the cart in the medication room. It was 4:37 a.m. The facility was quiet. The camera angle captured the locked cabinet where controlled substances were stored. The cabinet door never opened, yet the system logged a dose as administered. I spent 3 days reviewing every frame of footage, every entry in the access logs, every signature on every medication record. I found no evidence of tampering, no evidence of forgery, no evidence of human error. But I did find a pattern. Every dose logged under Harold Brennan's name occurred at the same time of day that he had historically received his medication while alive. 2:20 p.m., 9:15 p.m., 4:37 a.m. Those were the exact times his lorazepam had been scheduled. The system wasn't logging random entries, it was continuing his care plan. I stood in the hallway outside room 112 and tried to understand what that meant. Harold Brennan had been a resident for 4 years. He had severe anxiety, sleep disturbances, and occasional episodes of agitation. The lorazepam had been prescribed to manage his symptoms. It had been effective. His behavior had stabilized. His quality of life had improved. And now, 6 days after his death, the system was still administering his medication, as if his care plan were more durable than his life. I checked the room. It had been cleaned and reassigned. A new resident had moved in 2 days after Harold's death. Her name was Dorothy Eng. She was pleasant, cooperative, and required no psychiatric medications. I checked her chart. It was clean, no overlap with Harold's records, no prescriptions for lorazepam. Yet the medication cart continued to log doses under his name, at his scheduled times, as if his presence in room 112 were still active. I asked Patricia if we should disable Harold's resident ID in the system to prevent further entries. She agreed. We submitted the request to IT. The ID was deactivated, the care plan was archived, the medication schedule was deleted. We ran the controlled substance report the next morning. Another dose had been logged. Same resident ID, same medication, same time. The deactivation had not stopped it. Patricia contacted the state regulatory board and disclosed the discrepancy. An investigator was assigned. He arrived 3 days later and conducted a full audit of our medication protocols, our documentation practices, and our security systems. He found no violations. He found no explanation. He recommended we continue monitoring the situation and report any further discrepancies. Then he left. The doses continued. Over the next 2 weeks, 9 additional entries appeared, all for Harold Brennan, all for lorazepam, all at his scheduled times. I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped trying to prevent it. I simply documented each entry, reconciled the counts, and noted the discrepancy in the daily log. The system had decided that Harold Brennan's care was ongoing, and nothing I did could convince it otherwise. I began to notice other things, small things. The call light outside room 112 would activate occasionally, even though Dorothy never used it. The light would stay on for a few seconds, then turn off. The security footage showed no one pressing the button. The intercom would crackle with faint static at the times Harold used to call for assistance. No voice, just static. Dorothy mentioned once that she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room late at night, always at the same time, always stopping just outside her door. I told her it was probably staff making rounds. She said it didn't sound like staff. It sounded like someone pacing. I started checking the medication card at the times the doses were being logged. I would stand in the hallway watching the cart, waiting to see if anything happened. On the third attempt, I saw it. The cart was locked, stationary, unattended. Then, at exactly 2:20 p.m., one of the drawers unlocked. Not violently, not abruptly, just a quiet click, as if someone had entered the correct code. I approached slowly. The drawer was open. Inside, the compartment for lorazepam was accessible. I checked the tablet count. 3 tablets were missing. I checked the log. A dose had just been recorded, administered to Harold Brennan, signed by Linda Marsh. Linda was on the other side of the building. I stood there for a long time, staring at the open drawer, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was seeing with the procedural rigor of my training. I thought about Harold, who had been anxious, who had needed routine, who had relied on the predictability of his medication schedule to manage the chaos in his mind. I thought about care plans which were designed to provide structure, to impose order on suffering, to ensure that no one was forgotten. And I wondered if a care plan could become so embedded in a system that it continued to execute even after the person it was meant to help no longer existed. I closed the drawer, I locked the cart, I documented the discrepancy, and I stopped investigating. Because I had begun to suspect that the system wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was providing care. And it didn't matter whether the recipient was alive or dead. The care was the point. The continuation was the point. The routine was the point. Harold Brennan's medication allotment finally depleted last week. The last tablet was logged as administered at 4:37 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The system marked his prescription as complete. No refill requested, no further doses scheduled. The discrepancy resolved itself. But Dorothy Eng mentioned something to me yesterday. She said she's been sleeping better lately. She said the footsteps have stopped. She said the room feels quieter now, less restless, as if something that had been agitated has finally settled. I didn't tell her about Harold. I didn't tell her about the medication logs. I just smiled and told her I was glad she was comfortable. Some care plans don't end when the patient does. They just find new ways to fulfill their purpose. And sometimes the system knows better than we do what's needed, even when what's needed is impossible. Story 4. The call light that never reset. The call light for room 221 stayed lit for 11 minutes after Helen Mora died. I remember because I was the one who responded to it. I was finishing my documentation at the nurses' station when the panel chimed. I looked up and saw the indicator glowing amber. Room 221, non-urgent. I walked down the hallway, pushed open the door, and found Helen in her bed, still eyes closed, hands folded on her chest. I checked for a pulse. There was none. I checked for respiration. None. I noted the time, 6:43 p.m., and called for the attending physician. Then I pressed the call button on the wall panel to reset the light. It stayed on. I pressed it again. Still on. I held it down for 5 seconds. The light remained active. I assumed the button was stuck. I made a note to call maintenance and return to the nurses' station to complete the notification process. I had been a certified nursing assistant at Cedar Brook Extended Care for 12 years. I had seen hundreds of residents pass, some quietly, some in distress, most somewhere in between. Death was not unfamiliar to me. It was part of the routine. But what happened over the next 3 weeks defied every routine I knew. Helen Mora had been a resident for 7 years. She was 91, a former postal worker, cognitively sharp until the end. She had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and limited mobility, but she was alert, engaged, and well-liked by staff. She never abused the call button. She used it only when necessary, usually to request assistance with repositioning or hydration. The fact that the call light was active when she died was unusual. She hadn't been in distress earlier that evening. Her vitals had been stable. Her breathing had been labored but manageable. There was no reason for her to have called for help in her final moments. But the light was on, and it stayed on. Maintenance arrived the next morning. A technician named Roy Fisk inspected the call button panel in room 221. He tested the button. It functioned normally. He tested the wiring. No faults detected. He tested the connection to the central alert system. Everything was operational. He replaced the button assembly entirely just to be thorough. He tested it again. It worked. He documented the repair and closed the work order. I thanked him and returned to my shift. That evening at 6:43 p.m., the call light for room 221 activated. I was at the nurse's station. I looked at the panel. Amber light. Non-urgent. I walked to the room. It was empty. The bed had been stripped. The surfaces had been wiped down. The room was staged for the next admission. There was no one to have pressed the button. I checked the panel on the wall. The button was flush, not stuck. I pressed it to reset. The light turned off. I noted the time and returned to the station. Exactly 11 minutes later, it activated again. I reported it to the charge nurse, a woman named Gloria Vance. She came with me to the room. We tested the button together. It functioned correctly. We stood in the room and waited. The light stayed off for 15 minutes. Then, as we were about to leave, it turned on. Gloria pressed the button. It reset. We waited. It turned on again. She called maintenance. Roy returned the next day. He inspected the system again. He found nothing wrong. He replaced the entire wall panel, not just the button. He rerouted the wiring. He tested the circuit. Everything worked. He left. That evening, at 6:43 p.m., the light activated again. Over the next week, I documented every activation. The pattern was consistent. The light turned on at 6:43 p.m. every evening. It stayed on for 11 minutes unless manually reset. If reset, it would reactivate 11 minutes later. The cycle repeated until approximately 8 p.m., at which point it would stop until the following evening. The timing corresponded exactly to the period between when Helen had last been observed alive and when she was confirmed deceased. Gloria suggested we disconnect the call system in that room entirely. Roy did so. He physically disconnected the wiring from the panel to the central alert system. The light should have been inoperable. That evening, it turned on anyway, not on the central panel at the nurse's station. Just the light above the door. It glowed amber, visible from the hallway, even though there was no electrical connection. Roy came back. He removed the light fixture entirely. He capped the wires. He sealed the junction box. There was no possible way for the light to activate. That evening at 6:43 p.m., the indicator on the central panel lit up. Room 221. Non-urgent. I stopped reporting it to maintenance. I started documenting it in the shift log instead. Every evening I noted the activation. Every evening I walked to the room, confirmed it was empty, and pressed the reset button. The light would turn off. 11 minutes later it would turn on again. I began to recognize the pattern so clearly that I could set my watch by it. I started pre-writing the log entry at 6:40 p.m., knowing I would need it in 3 minutes. A new resident was assigned to room 221 2 weeks after Helen's death. Her name was Beatrice Kern, 86, admitted for post-surgical rehabilitation. She was mobile, alert, and independent. She did not require frequent assistance. I helped her settle into the room and explained the call button system. I did not mention the light. That evening, at 6:43 p.m., the call light activated. I responded. Beatrice was sitting in her chair, reading. She looked up at me, confused. She said she hadn't pressed the button. I told her it must have been a malfunction. I reset the light. 11 minutes later, it activated again. Beatrice called me into the room. She said she had been watching the button. No one had touched it. It had simply activated on its own. I apologized and told her maintenance was aware of the issue. She seemed skeptical but didn't press the matter. Over the next 3 days, the light activated every evening at the same time. Beatrice stopped calling me when it happened. She just waited for me to arrive, reset the light, and leave. On the 4th evening, she asked me who had been in the room before her. I told her a long-term resident had passed away. She nodded slowly and said that explained the footsteps. I asked her what she meant. She said she heard someone walking in the room late at night, pacing near the foot of the bed. She said it sounded like labored breathing, like someone struggling to catch their breath. I told her the building was old, sounds carried. She said it wasn't coming from another room. It was coming from inside hers. I checked the incident logs. No other residents had reported similar experiences. I checked the security footage. The hallway outside room 221 showed no unusual activity. I checked with the night shift staff. No one had entered the room outside of scheduled rounds. But Beatrice's reports continued. She said the pacing happened every night between 6:43 and 8 p.m. She said it stopped abruptly at 8, as if someone had finally found what they were looking for and left. I asked Beatrice if she wanted to be moved to a different room. She said no. She said she wasn't frightened. She said it felt more like someone was checking on her, making sure she was all right. She said it was oddly comforting. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and continued documenting the call light activations. 3 weeks after Helen's death, I was reviewing the response log and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Every time the call light activated, the log recorded my name as having responded. But on 2 occasions, I had been off duty. On 1 occasion, I had been on a scheduled break. Yet the log showed that I had entered the room, assessed the situation, and reset the light. The timestamps were accurate, the entries were detailed. But I had no memory of them. I asked Gloria if she had responded to the room on those dates. She said she hadn't. I checked with the other CNAs on shift. None of them had entered room 221 during those times, yet the log was clear. Someone with my credentials had accessed the room and completed a standard response protocol. I requested the security footage. The camera outside room 221 showed me entering the room, staying for approximately 90 seconds, and leaving. I watched the footage 3 times. It was me, my uniform, my gait, my ID badge, but I had no memory of it. I began to suspect I was experiencing some kind of dissociative episode. That the stress of Helen's death, combined with the repetitive nature of responding to the call light, had caused me to perform the task on autopilot without retaining the memory. I scheduled an appointment with my primary care physician. She found nothing wrong. No neurological issues, no signs of cognitive decline. She suggested I might be overworked and recommended I take a few days off. I declined. I needed to understand what was happening. I started paying closer attention to my movements during my shifts. I kept a handwritten log of every room I entered, every task I performed, every moment I was away from the nurses' station. I cross-referenced my notes with the electronic logs. Most of the time they matched, but occasionally the system recorded entries I didn't remember making, always in room 221, always during the call light activation window. One evening I decided to test it. I would not respond to the call light. I would remain at the nurses' station and observe what happened. At 6:43 p.m., the light activated. I stayed seated. I watched the panel. The light stayed on. I waited. 11 minutes passed. The light stayed on. I felt a growing sense of unease, as if I were violating some unspoken obligation. At 6:57 p.m., I stood and walked to the room. I didn't consciously decide to do it. I just found myself moving as if pulled by a routine stronger than my intention to resist. I entered the room. Beatrice was lying in bed reading. She looked up at me. I asked her what she meant. She said I came every evening at 6:57, checked on her, reset the light, and left. I told her I didn't remember doing that. I pressed the reset button. The light turned off. I returned to the nurse's station. I checked the log. An entry had been recorded at 6:57 p.m. My name, my credentials, standard response protocol completed. I stopped trying to resist. I accepted that whatever routine Helen had established during her 7 years in room 221 had imprinted itself so deeply that it continued to execute, with or without my conscious participation. And I had become part of that routine. The system had learned that room 221 required a response at 6:43 p.m., and it had learned that I was the one who provided it. Helen's call light finally stopped activating 6 weeks after her death. The last entry was logged at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening. The light turned off and never came back on. Beatrice said the footsteps stopped that same night. She said the room felt different, quieter, emptier. She was discharged 2 days later. Room 221 has been occupied by 3 different residents since then. None of them have reported hearing footsteps. None of them have experienced unexplained call light activations. The room functions normally now, but sometimes when I walk past it during my evening rounds, I feel the urge to stop, to check inside, to make sure everything is all right. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just find myself standing in the doorway, looking at the empty bed, pressing a button that doesn't need to be pressed. Some routines outlast the people who created them, and some of us become the hands that carry them forward long after we've forgotten why. Story 5. Care Plan Review. The care plan for Donald Richter showed improvement. That was the first thing I noticed when I opened his file during the quarterly review meeting. His mobility score had increased from a 2 to a 4. His speech clarity had improved from minimal verbalization to full sentences. His cognitive engagement had shifted from unresponsive to alert and oriented. These were significant changes. They indicated progress. They indicated recovery. The problem was that Donald Richter had been non-responsive for 8 months. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't walked. He hadn't opened his eyes. He lay in his bed in room 104, breathing steadily, receiving nutrition through a feeding tube, showing no signs of awareness. Yet according to his care plan, he was improving. I am a geriatric social worker at Greenfield Residence, a skilled nursing facility with 92 beds. My role involves coordinating care plans, facilitating family communication, and ensuring that each resident's treatment aligns with their documented goals and preferences. Care plans are reviewed quarterly and updated to reflect changes in physical health, cognitive function, and quality of life. The process is collaborative. I meet with the attending physician, the charge nurse, the physical therapist, and any relevant specialists. We review objective data, vital signs, lab results, behavioral observations, and adjust the care plan accordingly. The system is designed to be precise, evidence-based, and transparent. It does not allow for ambiguity. It does not allow for subjective interpretation. And it certainly does not allow for fictional progress. Donald Richter had been admitted to Greenfield 11 months earlier following a massive stroke. He was 79, a retired mechanical engineer, previously independent and cognitively intact. The stroke had caused extensive damage to his left hemisphere. He lost motor function on his right side. He lost speech. He lost the ability to swallow. His family had opted for comfort-focused care rather than aggressive intervention. The care plan reflected that decision. Manage pain, maintain hygiene, monitor vital signs, provide dignity. There was no expectation of recovery. The medical team had been clear about that. Donald's condition was stable but irreversible. He was not expected to regain consciousness. I had reviewed his care plan 3 months earlier. At that time, his scores across all functional domains were consistent with his clinical presentation. Mobility, 2 out of 10. Speech, 0 out of 10. Cognitive engagement, 0 out of 10. These scores had remained unchanged since his admission. There was no reason to expect them to improve. Yet when I opened his file for the current review, the scores had changed dramatically. I assumed it was a data entry error. Someone had updated the wrong resident's file. It happened occasionally, though rarely. I cross-referenced Donald's medical record number with the care plan entries. They matched. I checked the timestamps on the updates. They had been made incrementally over the past 3 months, with notes documenting gradual improvement at each stage. The notes were detailed. They described increased responsiveness to verbal cues, spontaneous movement of his right hand, attempts at vocalization during repositioning. Each note was attributed to a member of the care team: the charge nurse, the physical therapist, the speech therapist. I pulled the individual logs from each discipline. None of them matched the notes in the care plan. The charge nurse's documentation showed no change in Donald's status. The physical therapist had discontinued sessions due to lack of engagement. The speech therapist had never initiated treatment because Donald showed no signs of receptive or expressive language ability. I scheduled a meeting with the interdisciplinary team. I presented the discrepancy. The charge nurse, a woman named Ellen Stokes, reviewed the care plan on her tablet. She looked confused. She said she hadn't written those notes. She pulled up her own documentation. It showed Donald as unchanged, bedbound, nonverbal, unresponsive. The physical therapist, a man named Carl Raymond, said the same thing. He hadn't updated the care plan. He hadn't worked with Donald in months. The speech therapist, a woman named Jessica Tran, confirmed she had never treated Donald at all. Yet the care plan contained detailed progress notes attributed to each of them. I contacted the IT department to determine if there had been a system error. A technician named Marcus Levon accessed the database and reviewed the update history for Donald's file. He confirmed that the changes had been made internally, using valid staff credentials at valid timestamps. He checked for unauthorized access. There was none. He checked for automated updates or template errors. There were none. The entries were legitimate according to the system. They had been written by the staff members whose names appeared in the documentation. I told him that was impossible. He said the system didn't lie. If the entries were there, someone had written them. I printed the care plan and reviewed it line by line. The progression was methodical. The first update, made 3 months earlier, noted, "Resident opened eyes briefly during hygiene care." The second update, 2 weeks later, "Resident moved right hand when name was called." The third update, "Resident vocalized, low tone, no clear words." Each entry built on the previous one, creating a narrative of gradual recovery. The language was clinical, appropriate, indistinguishable from legitimate documentation. But none of it was real. I visited Donald's room. He was lying in bed, unchanged. His eyes were closed. His right side was flaccid. His breathing was steady but shallow. I spoke his name. There was no response. I touched his hand. No movement. I stood there for 10 minutes, observing, waiting for any sign that the documented improvements were accurate. There was nothing. I checked the care log at his bedside. The nurses had been documenting his status every shift. Every entry described him as non-responsive. Every entry contradicted the care plan. I returned to my office and called Donald's daughter, a woman named Laura Brennan. She had been his primary contact since his admission. I asked her if she had noticed any changes in her father's condition during her recent visits. She said no. She said he looked the same as he had for months. She said the staff had told her not to expect any improvement. I asked her if anyone from the care team had communicated recent progress to her. She said no. She sounded worried. She asked if something had changed. I told her I was reviewing his care plan and would follow up with her soon. I couldn't explain the discrepancy. I couldn't dismiss it as a clerical error because the entries were too detailed, too consistent, too progressive. Someone or something was documenting changes that weren't happening, and that someone was using the credentials of staff members who had no memory of writing the notes. I began checking other residents' files. I pulled 20 care plans at random and reviewed them for similar discrepancies. 19 of them were accurate, consistent with clinical observations. One was not. The file belonged to a resident named Margaret Oakes, room 217. She had advanced Alzheimer's disease. She was nonverbal, bedbound, and required total care. Her care plan, like Donald's, showed recent improvement, increased alertness, spontaneous verbalization, purposeful movement. I checked the direct care logs. They showed no change. Margaret remained non-responsive. I expanded the search. I reviewed every care plan in the facility. I found 4 more files with the same pattern. All of them were residents with severe cognitive or physical impairments. All of them showed documented improvement that contradicted clinical observations. All of them had notes written by staff members who didn't remember writing them. I reported the findings to the director of nursing, a woman named Sharon Wiley. She escalated the issue to the facility administrator. An internal investigation was launched. The IT department conducted a full audit of the electronic health record system. They found no evidence of tampering, no security breaches, no unauthorized access. The entries were generated internally using legitimate credentials. At times when those staff members were on duty, the system insisted the documentation was real. Sharon interviewed each staff member whose name appeared in the falsified notes. All of them denied writing them. All of them confirmed they had no memory of the interactions described. Some of them were visibly shaken. They felt violated, as if someone had stolen their identity to create a false record. But there was no evidence of identity theft. There was no evidence of malicious intent. There was only the documentation itself, which continued to populate. I visited Donald's room again a week later. His condition had not changed. But according to the care plan, he had begun to track movement with his eyes. The note read, "Resident followed staff member across the room with sustained visual attention." I stood in the doorway and moved from one side of the room to the other. Donald's eyes remained closed. I called his name. No response. I read the note again. It described an interaction that had not occurred, but the language was precise, the observation was clinical. It sounded exactly like something I would write if I had witnessed it. I began to suspect that the system was not documenting what was happening. It was documenting what should be happening, or what someone, something, believed should be happening, as if the care plan had become a template for an ideal recovery, independent of the actual resident's condition, and the system was filling in the details, creating a narrative of progress that existed only in the database. Over the next month, the updates continued. Donald's care plan documented full sentences, independent sitting balance, and voluntary participation in physical therapy. None of it was true. I stopped trying to correct the entries. I stopped reporting the discrepancies. I simply observed, because I had started to notice something else. The residents whose care plans showed false improvement were all individuals whose families had requested comfort care. They were all individuals for whom recovery was not expected. I didn't understand what that meant until Donald Richter died. It was quiet, expected. His vitals had declined gradually over the preceding week. The hospice team had been consulted. His daughter had been with him when he passed. I completed the death notification and closed his file. But before I did, I reviewed his care plan one final time. The last entry, dated the day before his death, read, Resident alert and oriented, verbalized comfort with end-of-life planning. I stood in my office, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile what I was reading with what I knew to be true. Donald had not been alert. He had not been oriented. He had not verbalized anything, yet the note was there, written in the clinical language of compassionate care, documenting a conversation that never happened. And that phrase, patient expresses readiness, felt less like a description and more like a conclusion. As if the system had been preparing him, documenting an internal process that was invisible to us, guiding him toward an acceptance we couldn't witness. I reviewed the other 4 residents whose care plans showed false improvement. All of them had passed within weeks of the final entry. I haven't reported this to anyone outside the facility. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know what it means. But I've started to wonder if care plans are more than administrative documents, if they're something closer to agreements, contracts between the facility and the residents, outlining not just what care will be provided, but what outcomes are anticipated. And maybe in cases where recovery isn't possible, the system writes a different kind of plan, one that documents a readiness we can't measure, one that prepares a person for an ending we can't fully understand. Some progress happens in places we can't observe, and some care is provided in silence, recorded only by systems that see more than we do. Story 6. The dining hall seating chart. The seating chart for Table 7 had not been updated in 4 months. I noticed this during a routine dietary review. Each table in the main dining hall was assigned a fixed group of residents to ensure dietary compliance, monitor intake, and facilitate social engagement. The chart was updated weekly to reflect admissions, discharges, and medical changes. Table 7 seated 6 residents. According to the chart, it had a full complement: Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, Alice Whitmore, Doris Penn, Leonard Travis, and Ruth Kimball. I recognized the names. I had processed discharge paperwork for 3 of them. Eleanor Boyd had passed 11 weeks earlier. Martin Cross had been transferred to hospice care 9 weeks earlier. Alice Whitmore had died 7 weeks earlier. Yet their names remained on the seating chart, and according to the dietary compliance logs, all 6 residents were being served meals daily. Attendance was marked as complete. There were no absences, no gaps, no empty chairs. I am the administrator of Willow Ridge Extended Care, a 114-bed facility with a reputation for operational excellence. My role requires me to oversee clinical operations, regulatory compliance, and quality assurance. Precision is the foundation of my work. I review systems, I audit documentation, and I ensure that every process functions as intended. The dining hall seating chart is a minor administrative tool, but it reflects the integrity of our tracking systems. If the chart was wrong, other systems might be wrong. And if other systems were wrong, we had a compliance problem. I pulled the dietary logs for Table 7. The logs documented meal service 3 times daily: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each entry listed the residents present, the food served, and the percentage consumed. The logs for the past 4 months showed perfect attendance: 6 residents, 3 meals per day, no missed meals. I cross-referenced the logs with the resident census. 3 of the 6 residents listed at Table 7 were no longer in the facility. They should not have appeared in any active documentation. Yet the logs showed them as present, eating, participating. I checked the entries for accuracy. The food items matched the standard menu. The portion sizes were appropriate. The consumption percentages varied realistically. Some meals fully consumed, others partially. The documentation looked legitimate. I walked to the dining hall during the lunch service. Table 7 was in the northwest corner near the windows. 6 residents were seated there. I approached slowly, observing from a distance. They were eating. conversing quietly, behaving exactly as residents did during mealtime. I recognized two of them, Doris Penn and Leonard Travis. Both were long-term residents, alert and mobile. I did not recognize the other four. I checked the seating chart on my tablet. The names matched: Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, Alice Whitmore, Doris Penn, Leonard Travis, Ruth Kimball. But I knew Eleanor, Martin, and Alice were deceased. I approached the table. I greeted Doris and Leonard by name. They smiled and responded politely. I asked them how the meal was. They said it was fine. I asked them if they were comfortable with their table assignment. They said yes. I looked at the other four residents. They were engaged in their meals, occasionally speaking to one another, occasionally glancing at me. They looked real, they behaved naturally, but I didn't recognize any of them. I returned to my office and pulled the admission photos for Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore. I compared them to my memory of the residents I had just seen at Table 7. There was no clear resemblance. The faces were different. The ages were different. The physical characteristics didn't match, yet the names on the seating chart insisted they were the same people. I called the dietary supervisor, a woman named Karen Moss. I asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about Table 7. She said no. I asked her if she had reviewed the seating chart recently. She said she reviewed it weekly. I asked her if she had noticed that 3 of the residents listed were deceased. There was a long silence. Then she said she would check and call me back. Karen called me 20 minutes later. She sounded shaken. She said she had just reviewed the discharge log and confirmed that Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore were no longer residents. She said she didn't understand how their names were still on the seating chart. She said she personally updated the chart every Monday and had never seen those names flagged for removal. I asked her if she had served them meals. She said yes. She said she remembered them. She said they had been at Table 7 for months. I asked her to describe them. She gave descriptions that matched the admission photos of the deceased residents. I asked her if she had served them today. She said yes. I returned to the dining hall. The lunch service was ending. Residents were being assisted back to their rooms by nursing staff. I watched Table 7. Doris and Leonard were helped to their feet by a CNA. The other 4 residents stood on their own. They moved slowly, carefully, like elderly individuals with limited mobility. They walked toward the exit. I followed them. They moved down the hallway in a group, supporting one another, speaking quietly. I lost sight of them as they turned the corner toward the residential wing. I quickened my pace. When I reached the corner, the hallway was empty. I checked the resident room assignments for Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore. All 3 rooms had been cleaned and reassigned. New residents occupied them. I walked to each room and verified the occupants. None of them were the individuals I had seen at Table 7. I asked the nursing staff if they had seen anyone unfamiliar in the hallways. They said no. I checked the security footage. The cameras in the dining hall showed Table 7 during lunch service. 6 residents were visible. I paused the playback and zoomed in on the faces. The resolution was poor, but the individuals were clearly present, clearly eating, clearly interacting. I followed the footage to the hallway. The group exited the dining hall and walked toward the residential wing. Then at the corner, they vanished. Not gradually, not off-screen. They simply stopped appearing in the frame. One moment they were there, the next they weren't. I reviewed footage from previous days. The pattern was consistent. Table 7 was always fully occupied during meal service. 6 residents, 3 meals per day, the same faces, the same behaviors, the same routines, and after each meal the group walked toward the residential wing and disappeared at the same corner. I scheduled a meeting with the dietary staff, the nursing supervisors, and the facility director of operations. I presented the findings. I showed them the seating chart, the dietary logs, the security footage. I explained that 3 of the residents listed at Table 7 had been deceased for months. I asked if anyone could explain how they were still being served meals, still being documented as present, still being observed by staff. No one could. Several staff members confirmed they had clear memories of serving the deceased residents. They described interactions, conversations, preferences. They remembered Eleanor Boyd requesting extra butter. They remembered Martin Cross asking for decaf coffee. They remembered Alice Whitmore complaining about the temperature of the soup. The memories were specific, recent, and detailed. But the residents they described had been dead for weeks. I contacted the state health department and requested an inspection. An investigator arrived 3 days later. She reviewed our records, interviewed staff, and observed the dining hall during lunch service. She confirmed that Table 7 was fully occupied. She confirmed that 6 residents were present. She confirmed that the dietary logs were accurate. She asked me to identify the residents by name. I pointed to Doris Penn and Leonard Travis. She asked about the other 4. I said I didn't know. She reviewed the seating chart. She asked if I was certain the other 4 were not current residents. I said I was certain. She asked to see their admission files. I pulled the files for Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore. She compared the admission photos to the residents seated at Table 7. She said the faces didn't match. I said I knew. She asked who they were then. I said I didn't know. The investigator spent 6 hours at the facility. She interviewed staff. She reviewed documentation. She observed meal service. At the end of her visit, she told me she had found no violations. The dietary program was compliant. The documentation was accurate. The residents were receiving appropriate care. I asked her how that was possible when 3 of the residents being documented were dead. She said the residents at Table 7 were real, they were present, they were eating. Whether or not they matched the names on the seating chart was an administrative discrepancy, not a care issue. She recommended I update the chart to reflect the current occupants. Then she left. I tried to update the chart. I removed the names of the deceased residents. I saved the changes. The next morning, the names were back. Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore, still listed at Table 7, still marked as present. I tried again. The system rejected the change. A dialog box appeared. Cannot remove. Resident actively participating in programming. I stopped trying to change the chart. I stopped investigating the identities of the residents at Table 7. I simply monitored the situation. And over the next 2 months, I began to notice something else. The residents at Table 7 never aged. They never declined. They never missed a meal. Their attendance was perfect. Their dietary intake was consistent. Their behavior was stable. They existed in a state of perpetual routine, as if the act of being seated, being served, and being documented had become more real than the individuals themselves. I sat in the dining hall one afternoon and watched them. Doris and Leonard, who I knew were real residents, ate their meals quietly. The other 4 engaged in conversation, passed condiments, gestured naturally. They were indistinguishable from any other group of elderly residents sharing a meal. Except that I knew they weren't residents. I knew they had no rooms, no charts, no medical histories. They existed only at Table 7, only during meal service, only in the logs and the footage and the seating chart. I've started to wonder if institutions create their own occupants. If the routines of care, the documentation of attendance, the allocation of resources, can generate a presence that persists independently of the people it was meant to serve. Or maybe Eleanor Boyd, Martin Cross, and Alice Whitmore never really left. Maybe they found a way to remain part of the community they had known by becoming part of the system that had cared for them. A system that didn't recognize death as a reason to stop setting a place at the table. Some seats are never truly empty, and some communities don't require the living to continue. To Story 7, Laundry Tag 117B. The tag came back in a mesh bag of freshly laundered clothing. I recognized it immediately. White plastic, rectangular, stamped with the facility's logo and a resident identification code. 117B. I pulled the garments from the bag, 2 cotton nightgowns, a cardigan, a pair of socks. None of them had been in circulation when I sent the last laundry batch out. I checked the tag. The name printed on it was Frances Lowell. Frances Lowell had been a resident at Cedarbrook for 6 years. She had passed away 14 months earlier. Her belongings had been collected by her family. Her clothing had been removed from the facility. Yet here was her laundry tag attached to items I had never seen before, returned in a weekly batch, as if she were still living here. I am the facilities and linen supervisor at Cedarbrook Extended Care. I manage housekeeping, maintenance, and laundry operations for a 98-bed facility. Personal laundry is a critical function. Residents' clothing is tagged upon admission to prevent loss, mixed loads, or misplacement. Each tag is assigned a unique identification code corresponding to the resident's name and room number. When a resident is discharged or passes away, their tag is deactivated and any remaining clothing is returned to the family. The system is straightforward. Tags do not reappear once they are deactivated. They do not attach themselves to new items. They do not generate laundry for residents who no longer exist. I logged the incident and contacted the laundry service. We contract with an off-site industrial laundry that processes all facility linens and personal clothing. I spoke with the operations manager, a man named Bill Cortez. I explained the situation. He said he would review the batch logs and call me back. He called 2 hours later. He said the tag had been included in the facility's delivery that morning. He said the items were laundered, pressed, and folded according to protocol. He said the tag had been scanned into the system when the batch was received and scanned out when it was delivered. I asked him where the clothing had come from. He said it came from our facility. I told him that was impossible. He said the tag didn't lie. If the tag came from Cedarbrook, the clothing came from Cedarbrook. I pulled the deactivation log for Frances Lowell's tag. It had been deactivated 13 months earlier. 1 month after her death, the log confirmed that all tagged items had been returned to her family. The tag should have been discarded. Yet here it was, active again, attached to clothing no one in the facility recognized. I examined the garments. The nightgowns were pale blue, standard cotton, no labels. The cardigan was beige, wool blend, slightly worn. The socks were white, ribbed, institutional quality. They looked like clothing that could have belonged to any elderly resident, but they didn't belong to anyone currently living at Cedarbrook. I checked our inventory. None of the items matched our stock. I checked with the nursing staff. No one had seen the clothing before. I checked with housekeeping. They hadn't found any unclaimed items in the laundry bins. I set the items aside and returned to my routine. The following week, the tag came back again. This time it was attached to a floral print blouse, a pair of gray slacks, and a bathrobe. I recognized the tag, 117B, Frances Lowell. I examined the clothing. It was clean, pressed, folded neatly. I had never seen any of it before. I checked the laundry log. The batch had been picked up from Cedarbrook 3 days earlier, processed and returned. I called Bill Cortez again. He confirmed the tag had been scanned in and out. He said the clothing had been included in our facility's laundry bin. I asked him to review the security footage from the pickup. He said he would. He called back the next day. He said the footage showed our standard laundry bins being loaded onto the truck. He said there was no evidence of contamination from another facility. The clothing was ours. But it wasn't. I knew every resident's wardrobe. I knew every tagged item in circulation. These garments didn't belong to anyone, yet the tag insisted they did, and the laundry system treated them as legitimate. Over the next 8 weeks, the tag returned 6 more times. Each time it was attached to different items: a sweater, a pair of pajama pants, a scarf, a dressing gown, none of them familiar, none of them from our inventory. I started documenting each occurrence. I photographed the items, I recorded the dates, I checked the resident census each time to confirm that no one currently living at the facility was missing clothing. No one was. The clothing was appearing from nowhere, being laundered and returning under Francis Lowell's name. I spoke with the director of nursing, a woman named Claire Hobbs. I showed her the documentation. She was skeptical. She suggested the clothing might belong to a current resident who had forgotten to tag their items properly, and the laundry service was incorrectly assigning them to the old tag. I told her I had checked. Every current resident's clothing was accounted for. She suggested the tag might be malfunctioning, generating false scans. I told her the tag was physical. It was attached to real garments. She had no other explanation. She told me to continue monitoring the situation. I decided to test the system. I removed the tag from the next batch of returned clothing and destroyed it. I cut it into pieces and discarded it in the facility's waste bin. The following week, the tag returned, intact, attached to a burgundy cardigan, 117B, Francis Lowell. I stared at it for a long time. I had destroyed the tag. I had watched it go into the trash, yet here it was, as if nothing had happened. I contacted Bill Cortez again. I asked him if it was possible for tags to be duplicated. He said no. Each tag was unique, printed with a single identification code. Duplicates weren't produced. I asked him if the laundry service kept archived tags. He said no. Deactivated tags were discarded. I asked him how the tag could have survived destruction. He said it couldn't. He suggested I was mistaken. Maybe I had destroyed a different tag. I told him I wasn't mistaken. He had no response. I began to suspect the tag was being reintroduced deliberately. Someone was printing a new tag with Francis Lowell's code and attaching it to unclaimed clothing. I reviewed the access logs for the tag printing system. No new tags had been printed for Francis Lowell's code. I reviewed the staff schedules to see if anyone had been assigned to laundry duties who might have access to archived tags. There was no evidence of tampering. No one had accessed the old tag. No one had recreated it, yet it continued to return. I visited the room Francis Lowell had occupied during her residency, room 209. It had been reassigned twice since her death. The current resident was a woman named Judith Crane, 84, admitted for post-surgical rehabilitation. I asked Judith if she had noticed anything unusual in the room. She said no. I asked if she had received any clothing that didn't belong to her. She said no. I asked if she had heard the name Francis Lowell. She said no. I thanked her and left. I checked the storage closets where unclaimed items were temporarily held. There were 3 cardboard boxes labeled Lost and Found. I opened them. Inside were miscellaneous items, glasses, books, slippers, but no clothing. I checked the donation bins where unusable items were sent. Nothing. The clothing tagged with 117B was not coming from the facility's inventory. It was not coming from current residents. It was not coming from storage. It was simply appearing, week after week, as if Francis Lowell were still living at Cedarbrook and generating laundry. I called Francis Lowell's family. Her daughter, a woman named Susan Dryden, answered. I explained the situation carefully, avoiding any implication of the supernatural. I told her that her mother's laundry tag had been appearing in recent batches and asked if she had any clothing that might have been left behind. Susan said no. She said she had collected all of her mother's belongings over a year ago. She said there was nothing left at the facility. I asked if she had visited recently. She said no. She hadn't been back since the funeral. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in the laundry room surrounded by bins of clothing waiting to be sorted and tried to understand what was happening. The tag was not a malfunction, it was not a duplicate, it was not a prank, it was the original tag somehow surviving destruction, somehow attaching itself to garments that didn't exist until they appeared in the laundry system. And the system treated it as routine. The scans registered, the logs updated, the clothing was cleaned, pressed, and returned. As if Frances Lowell were still a resident, as if she were still generating laundry, as if care were still required. I stopped destroying the tag. I stopped questioning its origin. I simply folded the returned clothing, placed it in a designated bin, and stored it in a locked closet. The tag continued to return every week. The clothing continued to accumulate. By the end of 6 months, I had collected 34 garments, all laundered, all neatly pressed, all tagged with 117B. I don't know where the clothing comes from. I don't know why the tag persists. But I've started to notice that the items are always clean, always in good condition, always appropriate for an elderly woman living in a care facility. They're not random. They're intentional. As if someone somewhere is still packing a suitcase, still preparing for admission, still expecting care to continue. Some belongings never leave. And some routines continue not because they're needed, but because they've been performed so many times that they've become permanent. Story 8. End-of-Life Conference Notes. The conference notes appeared in my inbox at 7:43 in the morning. I was at home, finishing my coffee, preparing to leave for work. I opened the email on my phone. The subject line read, "End-of-Life Conference Summary, Walter Novak." I frowned. I hadn't scheduled a conference for Walter Novak. I checked my calendar. There was no meeting listed. I opened the attachment. It was a full summary formatted in our standard template, documenting a family conference regarding comfort measures and hospice transition. The date stamp indicated the meeting had occurred the previous evening at 6:15 p.m. I had been off duty. I had been at home. Yet the notes were there, detailed and complete, attributed to me as the facilitating clinician. I am the director of nursing at Maplewood Care Center, a 106-bed skilled nursing facility. I oversee clinical operations, staff training, regulatory compliance, and end-of-life care coordination. End-of-life conferences are a core component of my role. They are scheduled meetings where I meet with residents' families to discuss goals of care, review prognosis, and document preferences for comfort-focused treatment. The process is formal. Conferences are scheduled in advance. Family members are invited. The attending physician participates. Notes are taken in real time, reviewed for accuracy, and filed in the resident's chart. The notes do not appear spontaneously. They do not write themselves. I reviewed the document carefully. It was thorough. It listed the participants, myself, Dr. Raymond Holt, attending physician, Walter Novak's daughter, Maria Voss, and Walter Novak's son, Patrick Novak. It documented the discussion. Prognosis reviewed, comfort measures explained, hospice referral agreed upon. It included direct quotes from family members. Maria Voss was documented as saying, "We want him to be comfortable." Patrick Novak was documented as saying, "He wouldn't want to suffer." The conclusions were clear: transition to hospice care, discontinue aggressive treatments, prioritize pain management. I had not conducted this meeting. I had not spoken with Walter Novak's family. I had not reviewed his prognosis with Dr. Holt, yet the notes described the meeting as if it had happened. and the decisions documented were exactly the decisions I would have made if the meeting had occurred. I called the facility. I asked the night shift supervisor, a nurse named Margaret Cross, if a family conference had taken place the previous evening. She said no. She checked the visitor log. No family members had signed in. She checked the conference room schedule. No meetings had been booked. I asked her to check Walter Novak's chart. She pulled it up and confirmed that the conference notes had been filed. They were time-stamped at 6:15 p.m. She said the notes looked legitimate. I told her they weren't. She asked how I knew. I told her I hadn't written them. She was silent for a moment. I arrived at the facility 30 minutes later. I went directly to Walter Novak's chart. The conference notes were there, printed and filed in the documentation section. The signature at the bottom was mine, not a digital signature, an actual handwritten signature in my handwriting in black ink. I stared at it. I had not signed this document. I had not written this document, yet there it was, filed in the chart as if I had conducted the conference myself. I contacted Dr. Raymond Holt. I asked him if he had participated in an end-of-life conference for Walter Novak. He said no. He said he hadn't reviewed Walter's case in over a week. I asked him if he had signed off on a hospice referral. He said no. I sent him a copy of the conference notes. He called me back 10 minutes later. He said the notes were accurate. The prognosis described in the document matched his clinical assessment. The recommendations aligned with his treatment plan. He said the notes documented exactly what he would have discussed if a conference had been held. But no conference had been held. I called Maria Voss. I asked her if she had attended a family meeting at Maplewood the previous evening. She said no. She said she hadn't been to the facility in over a week. I asked her if she had spoken with anyone from the care team recently. She said no. I asked her if she and her brother Patrick had discussed end-of-life planning for their father. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes, we talked about it 2 days ago. At my house, just the two of us, we decided we wanted him to be comfortable." I asked her if she had communicated that decision to the facility. She said no. She said she had been planning to call me later that day to schedule a conference. I told her the conference notes had already been filed. She asked how that was possible. I said I didn't know. I reviewed Walter Novak's medical history. He was 87, admitted 3 months earlier following a series of strokes. His condition had declined steadily. He was nonverbal, bedbound, and required total care. His prognosis was poor. The clinical team had been preparing to recommend a hospice consultation. But no formal recommendation had been made. No conference had been scheduled. Yet the notes documented a meeting that resulted in the exact care plan the team had been preparing to propose. I checked the conference room security footage. The camera showed the room empty at 6:15 p.m. on the date in question. No meeting had occurred. I checked the visitor log again. No family members had signed in. I checked my own badge access log. I had not entered the facility that evening. Yet the conference notes existed. They were filed. They were signed. They were complete. I contacted the electronic health record vendor. I explained the situation. A technician accessed the system remotely and reviewed the file. She confirmed that the notes had been uploaded at 6:17 p.m. She confirmed that my user credentials had been used to file the document. She confirmed that the signature was scanned from a handwritten form. I asked her if the system could generate documents autonomously. She said no. Documents had to be manually created and uploaded. I asked her if someone could have forged my credentials. She said the security protocols made that unlikely. I asked her how the document could exist if I hadn't created it. She said she didn't have an answer. I printed the conference notes and examined them closely. The language was precise. The observations were clinical. The conclusions were appropriate. The document was indistinguishable from notes I had written dozens of times before. It followed my phrasing patterns. It used my preferred terminology. It structured the discussion in the sequence I typically followed. It was as if someone had studied my documentation style and replicated it perfectly. Or as if the system had learned how I wrote and generated the notes on my behalf. I began checking other residents' files. I pulled 10 charts at random. 9 of them contained only documentation I recognized. One of them, a resident named Lorraine Huff, contained a set of end-of-life conference notes I had not written. The notes were dated 3 weeks earlier. They documented a meeting I had not attended, with family members I had not spoken to, resulting in decisions I had not facilitated. I called Lorraine's daughter. She confirmed that no meeting had occurred. She confirmed that she and her family had privately discussed their mother's care and had decided to transition to comfort measures. But they had not communicated that decision to the facility. Yet the notes documented it as if the conference had happened. I expanded the search. Over the next 2 days, I reviewed 50 resident charts. I found 7 additional sets of conference notes that I had not written. All of them documented meetings that had not occurred. All of them resulted in decisions that aligned with families' private discussions. All of them were signed with my handwriting. I reported the findings to the facility administrator, a man named Edward Mills. He reviewed the documentation. He contacted our legal counsel. An investigation was initiated. The findings were inconclusive. The notes were legitimate according to the system. They were filed correctly. They were signed appropriately. They documented clinically sound decisions. There was no evidence of fraud, no evidence of negligence, no evidence of unauthorized access. The notes simply existed. Edward asked me if I believed the system was generating the notes autonomously. I told him I didn't know what I believed. He asked if I thought someone was forging my documentation. I said no one had access to my handwriting. He asked if I thought I had written the notes and forgotten. I said that was impossible. He nodded. He didn't press further. He simply said we would continue to monitor the situation and ensure that all documented decisions were consistent with families' wishes. I've stopped trying to explain the notes. They continue to appear. Every few weeks, a new set of conference notes is filed. I don't write them. I don't attend the meetings they describe, but the decisions they document are always correct. They always align with what the family wants. They always reflect the care plan the clinical team was preparing to recommend. I've started to wonder if the system understands end-of-life care better than I do. If it can anticipate the conversations that need to happen, the decisions that need to be made, the permissions that need to be granted, or maybe it's documenting something that occurs outside of scheduled meetings, outside of formal conferences. Maybe families communicate their wishes in ways I don't witness, and the system listens. Some decisions are made in silence, and some care continues, not because we document it, but because it's already been approved by forces we can't see.